The rain hammered the reinforced glass of Terminal 5 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport with the kind of relentless fury that turned October mornings into battlegrounds. Water streaked down in sheets, blurring the
What was
outline
that?
of the massive
None of your
Boeing
business.
787
Focus on the
Dreamliner
approach.
waiting at Gate
On it.
B-12, its silver fuselage gleaming dully under the gray wash of storm clouds. Inside the terminal, travelers clutched coffee cups and stared at departure boards with the resigned frustration of people who knew delays were coming. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't thinking about the weather as she walked down the jet bridge. Her flight bag slung over one shoulder, her 3 gold first officer stripes catching the harsh fluorescent light. She was thinking about her father's last words. Muon bit lin hon that kumok kum ti dung ngoi trong phong hop. Hai dung anoi quin look kong ai te. Today, she was about to see the soul of Skyward Airlines, and it was going to be ugly. She paused outside the cockpit door, her hand hovering over the handle. 8 months. That's how long she'd been flying under her mother's maiden name Mitchell, instead of the surname that appeared on the deed to this entire airline. 8 months of early morning check-ins and transatlantic crossings of hotel rooms in Frankfurt and London and Tokyo, of being invisible in the uniform that her father had once worn with such pride. 8 months of listening, watching, waiting for the rot to show itself. Her father had warned her it ran deep, that the culture of Skyward Airlines had calcified into something toxic beneath its polished exterior. Thomas Mitchell had built this company from a single cargo hopper in 1987 into a multi-billion-dollar transatlantic carrier, but he'd also built walls too high and hired men who mistook cruelty for strength. On his deathbed at Northwestern Memorial, he'd made her promise not to rule from the executive tower. "Hai Bei," he'd whispered, his fingers trembling around hers. "Hainyin tan mat kon quaivat." So she flew, and today the monster was about to bare its teeth. Sarah took a breath and pushed open the door. The cockpit smelled like coffee and expensive cologne. Captain Robert Carson sat in the left seat. Silver hair perfectly slicked back with enough gel to survive a Category 5 hurricane, his jaw still sharp despite the softness creeping into his jowls. He was 58 years old and looked like a man who believed mirrors existed to confirm what he already knew about himself. The Rolex on his wrist caught the dim cabin light as he scrolled through his iPad, not bothering to look up. Sarah had read his file. 30 years with Skyward. 15,000 flight hours. 0 accidents. 3 complaints of hostile behavior toward junior officers, all buried by mid-level managers who'd long since retired with generous severance packages. The Silver Hawk, they called him. Untouchable. "Good morning, Captain. I'm First Officer Sarah Mitchell. I'll be your co-pilot for the Frankfurt flight today." She extended her hand, keeping her voice neutral, professional, the way she'd been trained at the academy in Denver, the way her father had taught her before that in the little Cessna 172 he'd kept at a grass strip outside Naperville when she was 16. Firm handshake, clear voice, eye contact. Never give them a reason to doubt you. Robert Carson didn't turn around. 5 seconds passed. 10. The only sound was the rain drumming against the fuselage and the low hum of auxiliary power. Sarah kept her hand extended, watching the back of his head, the way his shoulders remained perfectly still. This wasn't distraction. This was a choice. Finally, he rotated the captain's chair with the slow deliberation of a man who wanted her to understand that everything in this cockpit, including her presence, happened on his schedule. His eyes traveled from her face down to her uniform and back up again, lingering just long enough to make the assessment obvious. He didn't take her hand. "There's been a mistake." Sarah lowered her hand. Her expression didn't change, but something cold slid down her spine. "No mistake, Captain. I was assigned to Flight 628 last night. Crew scheduling updated the roster at 4 a.m. Your previous First Officer James Miller came down with stomach flu." Robert's eyes narrowed. "I know James Miller. James is a good pilot. James understands how I fly." Sarah stepped into the cockpit, setting her flight bag in the stowage compartment with practiced efficiency. "I'm sure he is. But James is currently in bed in Schaumburg, and I'm here. Shall we start the pre-flight check?" Robert stood. He was 6'2" and built like a linebacker who'd kept most of his college weight broad-shouldered and imposing in a way that had probably served him well for 3 decades. He moved to block the narrow aisle between the pilot seats, his bulk filling the space. "Hold on. You aren't hearing me. I said there's a mistake." Sarah paused, her hand on the back of the first officer's seat. The cockpit suddenly felt very small. "Captain Carson, I've reviewed the flight plan. Fuel load is confirmed. Weather briefing complete. I'm rated for this aircraft. In fact, I just transferred from the West Coast hub, where I've been flying the 787 for 3 years. There is no mistake." Robert let out a short laugh, the kind that had no humor in it. "West Coast. Right. They let anyone fly out there. Listen to me, sweetheart. This is Chicago to Frankfurt. This is the transatlantic route. We're talking crosswinds over the North Atlantic. Severe turbulence complex approaches into one of the busiest airports in Europe. This isn't some sunshine run to San Diego." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. "I'm aware of the route, Captain Carson. I've logged over 4,000 hours on this airframe, including 200 hours of transatlantic operations. I completed recurrent training in Denver last week. I'm qualified. Logged hours." Robert waved his hand dismissively. "I know how this works. I read the memos. The company's pushing for diversity. They want to fill quotas. They want pretty faces in the seats for the marketing materials. But I don't fly with brochures. I fly with pilots." The air in the cockpit went dead. This wasn't rudeness anymore. This was something else entirely, something that had been festering in the dark corners of Skyward Airlines for years, maybe decades. Sarah reached into her pocket and checked her phone, glancing at the time. "Captain, we have passengers boarding in 15 minutes. I am qualified. I am rested. I am here to do a job. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to initialize the flight management computer." She moved a step around him. Robert shoved the first officer's chair backward on its track, the metal screeching against the rail. The sound was violent, final. "You aren't touching my flight computer. I don't care who sent you. I don't care what quotas they're trying to meet. I am the captain of this vessel. My word is law, and I'm telling you I don't feel safe flying with you." Sarah looked up at him. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. His cologne was overwhelming, something woody and expensive that probably cost more than her rent. "You don't feel safe based on what evidence?" Robert's face flushed red. "Based on 30 years of experience knowing who has the right stuff and who doesn't. And looking at you, sweetheart, you're a liability. I'm not risking my life or my passengers' lives because HR wants to look progressive. Get off my plane." Sarah didn't flinch. She'd known this was coming the moment she saw the resistance in his shoulders, the contempt in his eyes. Her father had warned her. There are men in this company who think the sky belongs to them, who think anyone who doesn't look like them is an intruder. You'll meet them. And when you do, don't back down. Because the moment you do, you tell them they were right. Are you refusing to fly with me? Captain Carson, I want to be very clear about this. Robert crossed his arms over his chest, his Rolex glinting. I'm refusing. Go tell scheduling to send me a real pilot. Tell them I'll wait. But this plane doesn't move an inch until you're off it. Sarah held his gaze for 3 long seconds. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, could feel the weight of every choice collapsing into this single moment. Her father's voice echoed in her head, soft and steady, the way it had been in the hospital when the monitors beeped their slow countdown. Kan sa gap nyung kan kwai vut. Dung so chung. Haide chung lo met. Then the faintest trace of a smile touched her lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just watched their opponent walk into a trap they'd spent 6 months setting. Okay, Captain, I'll make a call. She turned and walked out of the cockpit, her footsteps even and measured. Behind her, Robert exhaled a sound of pure satisfaction. He dropped back into the captain's seat and reached for the interphone. Brenda, no Laura. Tell the gate agents to hold boarding. We've got a small crew scheduling issue. Just a little incompetence, nothing we can't handle. He leaned back into the leather, feeling the familiar comfort of the chair molding to his spine. 30 years. 30 years, and no one had ever made him fly with someone he didn't approve. Not management, not the union, not some quota-chasing directive from a boardroom full of people who'd never felt the yoke in their hands. He was Captain Robert Carson, the Silver Hawk, and this was still his sky. Sarah walked through the jet bridge and into the gate area. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of early morning departures. Travelers lined up at the desk, clutching boarding passes and passports, their faces tight with the anxiety of international travel. Announcements crackled over the PA system. Somewhere a baby cried. Sarah found a quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac, where the 787 sat in the rain like a sleeping giant. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking. Not much. Just enough that she had to steady her thumb before opening her contacts. She scrolled past names she'd memorized over 6 months of undercover work, fellow pilots and flight attendants who had no idea who she really was. Past crew schedulers and operations managers, past the burner numbers she'd used to maintain her cover. And then she found it. Kenneth Reynolds, chairman of the board. She pressed call. It rang twice. Sarah. Kenneth's voice was warm, grandfatherly, the kind of voice that had steadied her through her father's funeral and the brutal months that followed. "I thought you were wheels up to Frankfurt by now. Is everything all right?" Sarah turned slightly, watching the rain sheet across the window. "We have a situation, Kenneth. I'm at O'Hare. I've just been barred from the cockpit." Silence on the other end, heavy and sharp. Barred by whom? Captain Robert Carson. She kept her voice low and controlled the way she'd learned to do during depositions and shareholder meetings. "He explicitly stated he refuses to fly with a diversity hire. He physically blocked me from my seat and demanded a real pilot." Quote unquote. Kenneth's tone lost all its warmth. It became something else, something forged in 50 years of corporate warfare. "To you. Sarah, he called you that. To your face. He doesn't know who I am, Kenneth." Sarah watched her reflection in the glass, a shadow of a woman in a pilot's uniform that suddenly felt like armor. "To him, I'm just a black woman in a uniform he doesn't respect. He thinks I'm a quota filler. I will have him removed immediately." Kenneth's voice vibrated with anger. "I'll call airport security. I'll have him off that aircraft in 5 minutes." "No." Sarah spoke quickly. "Not yet. Sarah, he humiliated you." "He humiliated a first officer," Sarah corrected. "Kenneth, you know why I took this assignment. You know why I've been flying under my mother's name for 6 months. Dad left me this airline, but he told me the rot was deep. He told me the culture was toxic at the core. I needed to see it for myself." The words hung in the air between Chicago and wherever Kenneth was, probably his office in the Skyward Tower downtown, probably staring out at the same gray sky. "What do you want to do?" Sarah pressed her palm against the cold glass. "Let him dig the hole deeper. If Carson is this comfortable being openly racist to a colleague he thinks has no power, he's not alone. I need to see who else is complicit. I need witnesses." "Send Christopher Blake down here," the regional director Kenneth asked. "Yes. I want someone from management to see what happens next, because I'm going back into that cockpit, Kenneth, and I'm going to give Captain Carson exactly what he wants. A public confrontation. Sarah, be careful. I am. That's why I'm calling you instead of handling this alone." Kenneth was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. "Christopher is in Terminal 1. I'll send him to Gate B12 immediately." "Thank you, Sarah." His voice softened. "Your father would be proud of what you're doing, but he'd also tell you to protect yourself. These men, they don't fight fair." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "That's why I'm going to win." She ended the call and leaned against the wall, letting herself have 5 seconds of pure, unfiltered fear. Her hands were still shaking. Her throat felt tight. "Cha-oi," she whispered to the empty corner, to the ghost of the man who'd taught her to fly, and then left her an empire she wasn't sure she wanted. So, I'm scared. Not because Carson is big or mean. I'm scared because I'm doing this alone. But I won't give up. I promised you." She straightened, smoothed her uniform, and walked back toward the aircraft. The gate agent, a harried-looking man named Brian Hayes, glanced up from his computer. "First Officer Mitchell, Captain Carson just radioed. He said you were leaving." "There's a misunderstanding, Brian." Sarah spoke loudly enough that several passengers in the boarding area turned to look. "Captain Carson has refused to fly with me. He is currently holding the plane hostage until he receives a white male pilot. A hush fell over the front rows. Phones came out, black lenses focusing on her like accusatory eyes. Brian's face went pale. I'm sure he didn't mean it that way. I'm certain he was very clear. But I'm not leaving. I am the assigned pilot for this flight, and I'm going back onto that aircraft. Sarah turned and marched back down the jet bridge. She wasn't running away. She was giving Robert Carson the rope he so desperately wanted to hang himself with. Behind her she heard the murmur of passengers, the click of cameras, the beginning of something that would spiral far beyond this gate, this terminal this morning. Inside the cockpit, Robert was sipping his coffee and chatting with Laura Price, the lead flight attendant. Laura stood in the galley doorway, her face tight with the practiced anxiety of someone who'd spent 8 years learning to navigate Robert Carson's moods. It's ridiculous, Laura. Robert laughed, a self-satisfied sound. They send me a girl who looks like she should be serving drinks in the back, not flying the bird. I did everyone a favor. Laura shifted uncomfortably. She seemed qualified, Captain. We're already 20 minutes behind schedule. Relax. They'll find a reserve pilot. The cockpit door opened. Robert choked mid-sip coffee splattering across the center console in dark brown droplets. I thought I told you to get lost. Sarah stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. I am the first officer assigned to this flight, Captain Carson. I am not leaving my post because of your bigotry. Now, are we going to complete the pre-flight checklist, or are you going to explain to 320 people why you're canceling their trip to Frankfurt? Robert unbuckled his seatbelt so fast the metal buckle clattered against the armrest. His face went from red to crimson, the color of rage barely contained. You want an explanation? Fine, I'll give them an explanation. He shoved past her, his shoulder knocking into hers hard enough that she stumbled. Laura backed away from the galley entrance as Robert grabbed the PA handset from the wall mount. Captain Carson, don't. Laura started, but Robert was already keying the microphone. Get the passengers on board, he barked. I want an audience. Laura looked at Sarah, her eyes wide with something between horror and helplessness. Then she nodded to Brian Hayes at the gate desk, and the stream of passengers began flowing onto the aircraft. They walked into a war zone, businessmen in pressed suits, stowing laptops, overhead families with small children navigating strollers, elderly couples gripping armrests for balance. The cabin filled with the rustle of jackets and the thud of luggage. And at the front, blocking the aisle like a monument to his own authority, stood Captain Robert Carson. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice boomed without the microphone, though he held it anyway like a weapon. If I could have your attention while you stow your bags. We have a delay this morning, and I want you to know exactly why. He pointed a thick finger at Sarah, who stood near the cockpit door with her hands clasped behind her back, her face a mask of professional calm. This airline, in its infinite wisdom and political correctness, has assigned an unqualified affirmative action hire to sit in the right seat of my cockpit. The cabin went dead silent. A businessman in row 2 dropped his magazine. A woman in row 5 gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Phones came out in a wave, a dozen, then 20, then more lenses focusing on Robert's flushed face and Sarah's steady gaze. I have refused to fly with her. Robert's voice rose, feeding on the attention, the power of the moment. I have demanded a competent pilot, but she refuses to leave. So here we sit delayed while she plays dress-up in a uniform she has no business wearing. He turned to Sarah with a sneer that was equal parts triumph and contempt. Are you going to leave now, honey? Or are you going to ruin everyone's day just to prove some kind of political point? Sarah took one step forward. The movement was small, but every eye in the forward cabin tracked it. I'm not leaving, Captain Carson, and neither are you, because you just violated Federal Aviation Regulation 91.13 regarding careless and reckless operation and approximately 5 different company policies on discrimination and hostile work environment. Robert laughed, but it sounded hollow now, tinged with uncertainty. You think I care about policy? I've been here 30 years. Who are you? Nobody. Just a girl who got handed a job she didn't earn. Movement at the jet bridge door cut through the tension. Christopher Blake burst onto the aircraft, his suit soaked through from the sprint across the terminal, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was breathing hard, his face flushed from exertion or panic or both. Captain Carson, he gasped, his voice barely above a wheeze. Stand down, now. Robert turned, and for the first time a flicker of confusion crossed his face. Blake. Good. Tell this woman to pack her bag so we can leave. Tell her that the Silver Hawk doesn't fly with dead weight. Christopher didn't even look at Robert. He walked straight past him, stopped in front of Sarah, and did something that made every passenger lean forward in their seats. He bowed his head. Ms. Mitchell, I apologize for arriving late. Kenneth Reynolds called me. I came as fast as I could. Robert's confusion deepened into something close to panic. Ms. Mitchell Blake. Why are you calling her that? What is this? Sarah unbuttoned her blazer with slow, deliberate movements. Underneath, pinned to her shirt, was her standard pilot ID. But from her inner pocket she pulled a lanyard she usually kept hidden. It was platinum and black, the kind of credential only 3 people in the entire company possessed. She held it up so the light caught the embossed lettering. Skyward Airlines, Chief Executive Officer, Sarah Mitchell. The name hit Robert like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse standing upright. The passengers in business class erupted in gasps and murmurs, phones recording every second. Captain Carson Sarah said, her voice carrying to the back rows, with the practiced projection of someone who'd given speeches to shareholders and senators, "You asked who I am. I am Sarah Mitchell, owner and Chief Executive Officer of Skyward Airlines." The silence that followed was suffocating. Robert staggered backward half a step, gripping the back of a seat to keep from falling. Christopher Blake stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to meet Robert's desperate gaze. Laura Price stood frozen in the galley, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. And Sarah, standing in the center of the aisle with her platinum ID catching the cabin lights, looked like an avenging angel in navy blue. "And you, Captain Carson, are fired." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. 3 seconds passed. 5. 10. Robert's brain finally caught up to the reality crashing down around him. His knees buckled slightly. He reached out for the seat back again, his fingers trembling. "Ms. Mitchell," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know. This was just cockpit banter. You know how it is. Old guard breaking in the newbies. Hazing. I didn't mean anything by it. Banter." Sarah's voice was ice. "You violated federal law as banter. You humiliated a fellow professional in front of passengers as banter. You delayed a $350 million asset and inconvenienced 320 paying customers as banter." Robert's hands shook. "I've been flying for 30 years. My record is spotless. You can't fire me for one bad morning. I have a pension, seniority, rights. Your record is spotless because people covered for you." Sarah glanced toward Laura, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the galley floor, because nobody dared challenge the Silver Hawk. "But that era ended 8 months ago when my father died and left me this company. You just didn't get the memo." Sarah stepped past Robert and picked up the PA handset he'd dropped. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sarah Mitchell speaking. I am a qualified 787 pilot, and yes, I am also the CEO of Skyward Airlines. I want to personally apologize for the appalling display you just witnessed. The behavior of Captain Carson represents everything I am working to eradicate from this company. It will not be tolerated. We will need to deplane you briefly while I arrange for a new flight crew. You will all receive substantial compensation for this delay and a formal apology in writing. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for bearing witness." She clicked off the PA. Scattered applause broke out in the cabin, growing louder as more passengers joined in. A woman in row 8 stood up, clapping with her hands above her head. Others followed. "Please." Robert whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Don't do this. I have a family. Grandchildren. Hand over your credentials." "Mr. Carson?" Sarah's voice was flat, emotionless. "Airport security is on their way to escort you from the terminal." Christopher Blake stepped forward and carefully took the ID badge that Robert unclipped from his shirt with numb fingers. The FAA certificate followed, pulled from his flight bag with shaking hands. Sarah turned her attention to the galley. Laura Price and 3 other flight attendants huddled there, their faces pale. "Laura, isn't it?" Sarah walked toward them. "Yes, Ms. Mitchell," Laura squeaked. "I'm so sorry about the captain. We had no idea he would do that." "Did you—" Sarah studied her face. You didn't seem surprised when he refused to let me sit down. You didn't seem surprised when he grabbed the microphone to humiliate me. You just seemed resigned." Laura looked at her shoes. "Captain Carson can be difficult. We try to keep the peace, we just do our jobs. Your job is passenger safety and enforcing company policy. When he breached cockpit protocol with aggression, you said nothing. When he violated anti-discrimination policy, you said nothing. When he dragged you into his public tantrum, you obeyed him." One of the younger flight attendants, Ashley Ford, spoke up defensively. "He's the captain. We have to listen to him. Not when his orders are illegal or unethical," Sarah said sharply. "There is a hierarchy, yes, but there is also a duty to act when you witness abuse." Sarah looked at all four of them, seeing the systemic rot her father had warned about. It wasn't just the loud aggressors like Robert Carson. It was the silent enablers, the people who looked away because confrontation was uncomfortable, because keeping your head down was easier than standing up. Culture doesn't change if we only remove the loudest problems. It changes when we stop accepting silence as an excuse. She took a deep breath. This was the part that would keep her awake at night, the part that felt like wielding a sword when she'd rather extend a hand. But her father's voice was there, steady and sure. "Con fai kung bang, yung con kung fai quit duan." Be fair, but be decisive. "Christopher, collect their badges." Laura gasped. The younger attendant burst into tears. "You can't. We didn't do anything." "Exactly," Sarah said quietly. "You didn't do anything. And at Skyward Airlines that is no longer enough. The entire cabin crew is suspended with pay effective immediately for 90 days. You will participate in a mandatory 6-week training program on crew assertiveness and safety culture intervention. After 6 weeks, there will be an evaluation. Those who pass will be reinstated. Those who fail will be terminated." Laura's tears spilled over. Ashley looked like she'd been slapped. The two other attendants, Melissa Grant and Joshua Reed, stood in shocked silence. Christopher Blake moved through the galley, collecting ID badges with the grim efficiency of a man who'd done unpleasant tasks before. "Thank you for the chance," Laura whispered. "I won't let you down." "I know," Sarah said. "But words aren't enough anymore. Show me." They filed off the aircraft, heads down, shoulders slumped. The passengers watched in silence, the applause fading into something more somber. Sarah stood alone in the forward galley, the weight of 320 pairs of eyes on her back. She leaned against the counter for just a moment, closed her eyes, and let herself feel the full, crushing enormity of what she'd just done. "Cha oi," she thought, "did I do the right thing? Laura has 2 children. Ashley is only 26. But if I don't do this, if I let silence be an acceptable response to hatred, then nothing changes. The cycle continues. And 10 years from now, another woman will stand where I'm standing, facing another Robert Carson, and nothing will have changed except the names." She opened her eyes and walked back into the cabin. Christopher Blake stood near the cockpit door, pale and sweating. "Ms. Mitchell, I'll have a reserve crew here within 45 minutes. I've authorized triple overtime. We'll get this flight in the air." "Good." Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "And Christopher, I want Marcus Thorne." "No Jonathan Harris on the phone," our general counsel Christopher asked. "Yes." "I want the paperwork for these terminations ironclad by noon. I want every I dotted and every T crossed. Carson is going to sue, I know. And when he does, I want our legal position to be bulletproof. Understood." Christopher hesitated. "Ms. Mitchell, for what it's worth, a lot of us have wanted to do what you just did for years, but we didn't have the authority or the courage." Sarah looked at him, this middle-aged man in a soaked suit who'd run through the rain because the chairman of the board had called him. "You have the authority now, Christopher. Use it. If you see something like this again anywhere in this company, you act. You don't wait for me. You don't wait for permission. You act. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." He straightened his shoulders. "I won't let you down." Sarah nodded and turned back to the passengers, many of whom were still recording on their phones. The videos were already uploading, already going viral, already being shared across social media platforms with hashtags that would trend within the hour. She could feel the weight of it the moment when a private confrontation became public spectacle, when justice became performance. But there was no going back now. The walk from the aircraft to the main terminal felt like a funeral procession. Airport security flanked Robert Carson, two Port Authority officers in crisp uniforms guiding him through the jet bridge. He wasn't in handcuffs, but he might as well have been. His shoulders were hunched, his gait shuffling, the arrogance burned out of him and replaced with something hollow and broken. His pilot's jacket hung loose on his frame, the epaulets stripped of the credential that had defined him for 3 decades. Every airport employee they passed did a double-take recognition flickering across their faces. The Silver Hawk, grounded and humiliated, being marched through his own domain like a common criminal. Sarah watched from the gate desk as he disappeared into the crowd. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a deep, aching sadness for all the years this had been allowed to happen, for all the people who'd been driven out of aviation because men like Robert Carson had made the cockpit feel like enemy territory. Ms. Mitchell, Christopher Blake, appeared at her elbow. The reserve crew is 30 minutes out. Captain Michelle Torres and a full cabin crew. Torres is excellent. Sarah knew Michelle Torres. She'd reviewed every senior captain's file during her 6 months undercover, looking for the ones who led with integrity instead of intimidation. Good. I'll fly right seat with her. Christopher blinked. You're going to fly the trip. I'm a qualified first officer, Christopher. And these passengers have been through enough. They deserve to get to Frankfurt. Plus, she added with a small smile, I need to prove I can actually do the job Robert Carson claimed I couldn't. 45 minutes later, Sarah sat in the right seat of the 787, running through the pre-flight checklist with Captain Michelle Torres. Michelle was 50 years old with silver streaks in her dark hair and a calm competence that radiated from every movement. She'd been flying for Skyward for 22 years and had never once filed a complaint or raised her voice. She was everything Robert Carson wasn't. Pre-flight complete, Captain Mitchell. Michelle's voice was steady, respectful. Sarah smiled. Captain Torres is fine. We're a crew. Let's get these people to Frankfurt. The passengers reboarded with an energy that felt almost celebratory. They weren't angry about the delay anymore. They were part of something, witnesses to a moment that would be replayed and analyzed and debated for months to come. As they settled into their seats, Sarah keyed the PA one more time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell. Thank you for your incredible patience today. We have cleared the negativity from the flight deck, and we are ready for a smooth ride across the Atlantic. And because you've all been such good sports, drinks are on the house today. The cheer that erupted was so loud it rattled the cockpit door. Sarah glanced at Michelle, who was grinning. That's one way to build customer loyalty, Michelle said. Sarah laughed, a real laugh that broke through the tension coiled in her chest. Let's fly. O'Hare Tower. Skyward 628. Heavy ready for departure. Runway 10. Left. Skyward 628 cleared for takeoff. Runway 10 left. Winds 090 at 15 gusts to 25. And Captain Mitchell. The controller's voice carried a note of warmth that was distinctly unprofessional and entirely human. We saw the video. Good for you. Thank you, Tower. Skyward 628 rolling. Sarah pushed the throttles forward. The GE9X engines roared to life, 85,000 pounds of thrust pressing her back into the seat. The aircraft surged down the rain-slicked runway, water spraying from the wheels in great arcs. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. Chicago fell away beneath them, the city dissolving into gray clouds and silver rain. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls now, all the fear and uncertainty burned away by adrenaline and the pure, undiluted joy of flight. Cha-oi, she thought as they climbed through 10,000 feet. Con dang bai. I'm flying, not just this airplane. I'm flying your company out of the darkness. At 12,000 feet, the radio crackled. Skyward 628, Chicago departure. Climb and maintain flight level 350. The voice paused, then added off-script and against every protocol. Congratulations, Captain. We're all rooting for you. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Thank you, Chicago departure. Skyward 628 climbing to 350. Michelle Torres glanced at her, eyebrows raised. You're going to be famous after today. Sarah shook her head. I don't want to be famous. I want to fix what's broken. Michelle was quiet for a moment. her hands moving across the flight controls with the easy grace of decades of experience. Then you picked the right fight. While Sarah was climbing through the clouds over Lake Michigan, Robert Carson sat on a plastic bench in the baggage claim area outside the secure zone, shivering in his shirt sleeves. Security had confiscated his badge, which meant he couldn't access the crew lounge to retrieve his coat. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands and saw his wife's name on the screen. Patricia. They'd been married for 27 years. She was a social climber, the kind of woman who thrived on being introduced as the wife of a senior airline captain. She loved the travel benefits, the status the country club membership his salary afforded. "Patricia," he said, his voice cracking. "Honey, I need you to come pick me up. Something crazy happened at work. I saw." Her voice was ice-sharp and unforgiving. "It's all a misunderstanding," Robert tried. "That woman is a billionaire," Patricia snapped. "And you are a viral idiot. Do you have any idea what my phone looks like right now? Linda from the book club sent me a link to a GoFundMe someone set up to buy you a brain, Robert. The news vans are parked in front of our house. I am not letting a racist in my front door. Patricia, please, I need you. Check your email, Robert." The bank called. "Apparently Skyward Airlines already froze your corporate credit card. Good luck finding a hotel you can afford." The line went dead. Robert stared at his phone, his reflection ghostly in the black screen. He opened his banking app with numb fingers. His personal savings account showed $42,000, a number that sounded substantial until he remembered the mortgage on their house in Lincoln Park, the 2 Mercedes payments the boat docked at Burnham Harbor. His lifestyle burned through money like jet fuel. He needed his pension. He needed severance. He needed this to not be happening. But it was happening. He could see it in the faces of the people walking past him. The double takes, the whispered conversations, the phones pointed in his direction. He was trending on social media. He was a meme. He was the villain in a story that would be told and retold until his name became synonymous with everything wrong with American corporate culture. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and pulled out his phone again. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in 5 years. Jeffrey Kane, attorney at law. Kane was a shark, an ambulance chaser who specialized in suing airlines and had a reputation for being willing to fight dirty. Robert dialed. "Kane." The voice was sharp, impatient. "Jeffrey, it's Robert Carson. I need to sue Skyward Airlines. Wrongful termination, defamation, emotional distress. I want $50 million. There was a pause. "I saw the video, Robert. You looked pretty bad." "It was edited." Robert's voice rose, desperation creeping in. "Taken out of context. Plus, I have leverage. I know things. I know about the fuel hedging scandal in 2019. I know about maintenance deferrals on the Airbus fleet, things they swept under the rug. I can burn them down if I have to." Kane hummed thoughtfully. "Dirt is good. Dirt I can work with. Come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring everything you have. Every document, every email, every scrap of evidence. We're going to war." Robert hung up and allowed himself a grim smile. Sarah Mitchell thought she'd won. She thought she could humiliate him, destroy him, and walk away clean. But she'd made a mistake. She'd left him alive. And a wounded animal was the most dangerous kind. He would sue. He would leak. He would drag Skyward Airlines through the mud until its stock price tanked and its reputation lay in ruins. And when it was over, when Sarah Mitchell was scrambling to salvage her father's legacy from the wreckage, he would be the one smiling. He walked out of the terminal into the rain, his shirt soaking through in seconds, and started looking for a cab. Behind him on the departures board, Flight 628 to Frankfurt updated its status. Airborne. On time. The applause still echoed in Sarah's ears 6 hours later as Flight 628 descended through German airspace toward Frankfurt. The Atlantic crossing had been smooth, the kind of flight that justified every hour she'd spent in simulators and every sleepless night studying weather patterns and approach procedures. Michelle Torres had handed over the controls somewhere over Greenland, letting Sarah fly the ocean crossing manually while autopilot slept. There was something meditative about it, about feeling the aircraft respond to minute adjustments of the yoke, about watching the horizon line hold steady through breaks in the clouds. For those hours, Robert Carson didn't exist. The viral videos didn't exist. There was only sky and speed and the pure mechanical grace of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. But now, as the wheels touched down on runway 25C with barely a chirp, reality came flooding back. Her phone, which she'd silenced for the flight, showed 47 missed calls and over 200 text messages. The first call was from Kenneth Reynolds. The second through fifth were from Jonathan Harris, Skyward's general counsel. The rest were reporters, board members, and numbers she didn't recognize. The text messages ranged from supportive to vicious, from fellow pilots congratulating her to anonymous accounts calling her every slur they could think of. Sarah powered down her phone and focused on the taxi to the gate. One crisis at a time. In the terminal, the passengers deplaned with the reverence of people who'd witnessed something they'd tell their grandchildren about. Several stopped to shake her hand. A businessman in his 60s gripped her palm with both hands. "My daughter wants to be a pilot. Thank you for showing her it's possible." An elderly woman pressed a note into her hand with a phone number scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You call me if you need a character witness. I saw everything." Sarah tucked the note into her pocket and made her way through customs and immigration through the bright, sterile corridors of Frankfurt Airport until she found a quiet corner near a closed cafe. She turned her phone back on and called Kenneth. The board met this afternoon, he started without preamble. Emergency session. Sarah leaned against the wall, exhaustion hitting her like a physical weight. "And they're behind you, unanimously. But there are concerns." "Of course there are." Sarah closed her eyes. "What kind of concerns? Jonathan will brief you, but the summary is this. Carson's threatening to sue for $50 million. His lawyer, Jeffrey Kane, is already drafting complaints. They're alleging wrongful termination entrapment because you concealed your identity, violation of union due process, and defamation." Kenneth's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd spent 40 years navigating corporate warfare. "Kane's also threatening to leak damaging information about maintenance practices if we don't settle." Sarah's eyes snapped open. "Maintenance practices? What maintenance practices?" "Rumors," Kenneth clarified quickly. "The fuel hedging thing from 2019 that your father cleaned up before he died. Some maintenance deferrals on the Airbus fleet that were all properly documented and within FAA guidelines. Nothing criminal, nothing that would ground aircraft. But Kane's going to spin it as a safety crisis if we go to trial." "Let me guess." Sarah said, her voice hard. "Jonathan wants us to settle. Pay Carson $5 million, have him sign an NDA, make him go away quietly." "Jonathan thinks it's the prudent move," Kenneth admitted. "A trial will keep this story in the news cycle for months. It'll give Carson a platform. If he leaks anything true or not, our stock takes a hit. Better to pay him off and move on." "No." The word came out flat and final. "Sarah, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. If we pay Robert Carson to go away, we tell every bigot in this company that they can scream loud enough and we'll write them a check. We tell every woman, every person of color, every marginalized employee that their dignity has a price tag and it's negotiable. I won't do it. You're putting principles over pragmatism." Sarah's voice dropped to something colder than the Frankfurt winter outside. "My father built this company on the principle that we fly safely and we treat people with respect. Carson violated both. I'm not betraying Dad's legacy to save a few points on the stock price." There was a long silence. Then Kenneth sighed. "You sound exactly like him. Is that a compliment or a criticism?" "Both. He was stubborn too." "What do you want to do?" Sarah straightened her mind, already racing through the implications. "I want a forensic audit of Robert Carson's entire career. Flight logs, expense reports, maintenance sign-offs, everything. If he's threatening to leak our secrets, he's doing it because he thinks he's untouchable. Men like that don't just break the rules socially. They break them professionally. Find me what he's hiding." Kenneth was quiet for 3 beats. "You think he's dirty. I think 30 years of unchecked power corrupts. And I think a man who's comfortable being openly racist in front of witnesses is comfortable cutting other corners too. Find the smoking gun, Kenneth. I want to know why Robert Carson thought he could treat people the way he did and get away with it." I'll have Jonathan put together a team. But Sarah, this will take time. Weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, Carson's lawsuit moves forward. Then let it move forward. We'll fight it in court. We'll win in court. And when we do, every pilot in this company will know that the old rules don't apply anymore. Sarah ended the call and slumped against the wall. Her hands were shaking again, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash that came after hours of holding herself together. She wanted to sleep for a week. She wanted to scream. She wanted her father back. Wanted to hear his voice telling her she was doing the right thing, that the path would be hard but worth walking. Instead, she had an empty terminal in a foreign city and the weight of a multi-billion-dollar company resting on decisions she was making in real time with incomplete information and no safety net. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michelle Torres. "You okay?" Sarah typed back. "Tired. Proud of you. Get some rest. You earned it." Sarah pocketed her phone and headed for the Crew Hotel, a sterile 4-star chain near the airport where Skyward contracted rooms. She'd sleep for 6 hours, wake up, fly the return leg to Chicago, and then deal with whatever fires were burning. One crisis at a time. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the executive boardroom of Skyward's headquarters in downtown Chicago. The room was all glass and steel floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, which churned gray and angry under November clouds. Jonathan Harris sat at the mahogany table with a stack of legal documents thick enough to stop a bullet. Across from him sat Kenneth Reynolds, Christopher Blake, and 2 lawyers from the firm Skyward kept on retainer for exactly this kind of nightmare. The lawsuit landed this morning. Jonathan started sliding a bound document across the table to Sarah. She flipped it open. Page 1 listed the plaintiffs. Robert Carson. Page 2 listed the defendants. Sarah Mitchell personally. Skyward Airlines, Inc. The causes of action went on for 30 pages. Wrongful termination in violation of the collective bargaining agreement, constructive fraud and misrepresentation of identity, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation per se. The prayer for relief demanded $50 million in compensatory and punitive damages, plus reinstatement of all benefits, including pension and seniority. "This is garbage," Sarah said, flipping pages. "He called me a diversity hire on camera. We have 20 videos from 20 different angles. The wrongful termination claim won't survive summary judgment." "Normally I'd agree," Jonathan replied, "but Kane's argument is more sophisticated than it looks. He's claiming you entrapped Carson by concealing your identity. He argues that as CEO you had a duty to disclose your position before engaging with employees in their workplace. He's saying you set him up to fail. That's insane." "Perhaps, but it's legally arguable, and the union is backing him." Sarah looked up sharply. "The union is supporting this." "Not officially," Kenneth clarified, "but their regional rep Gary Stevens has been making noise. He's claiming this sets a dangerous precedent that management can't go undercover to manufacture termination causes. He's worried about other pilots." "Let him worry," Sarah said coldly. "The union exists to protect workers from unfair treatment, not to shield bigots from consequences. What about the defamation claim?" "That's the tricky one," Jonathan admitted. "Carson's argument is that by publicly firing him and allowing passengers to record it, you knowingly exposed him to public ridicule and destroyed his professional reputation. He's claiming you could have handled it privately but chose public humiliation as punishment." "I chose transparency," Sarah countered. "I could have had security remove him quietly, buried it in HR paperwork, paid him severance, and let him retire with dignity. That's what the old Skyward would have done. That's why the rot got so deep. Sunlight is the best disinfectant." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I'm not disagreeing with you on principle. I'm telling you what we're up against in court. Kane's going to paint you as a vindictive CEO who humiliated a senior employee to make a political statement. He's going to argue that even if Carson was wrong, your response was disproportionate and malicious." "Then we prove it wasn't disproportionate," Sarah said. "We prove that Robert Carson wasn't just a bigot. We prove he was dangerous." She looked at Kenneth. "How's the audit coming?" Kenneth glanced at Jonathan, then back at Sarah. "We've assembled a team. Forensic accountants, former FAA investigators, data analysts. They're going through 10 years of records. It's slow work. How slow conservatively 6 weeks to get preliminary findings, 8 to 10 weeks for a full report we can take to court. Sarah's jaw tightened. Carson filed suit today. He'll move for expedited discovery. We'll be in depositions within a month. We need something faster. Jonathan leaned forward. Sarah, if we're going to settle now, is the time. Before discovery, before this becomes a media circus. Once we're in court, the costs multiply. Legal fees, executive time, reputational damage. Even if we win, we lose. How much is Kane asking for in settlement talks? $5 million. Non-admission of wrongdoing. Full NDA. Carson retires quietly, keeps his pension. We agree not to contest his unemployment claim or disparage him publicly. Sarah stood and walked to the windows. The lake stretched out like beaten metal whitecaps churning in the wind. $5 million. A rounding error in Skyward's annual budget. A cheap price for making this disappear. But it wasn't about the money, it was about what came next. Every captain who'd ever screamed at a subordinate, every manager who'd ever buried a harassment complaint, every old guard executive who thought diversity meant lowering standards, they'd all be watching. If she paid Robert Carson, she'd be telling them that the new Skyward was just the old Skyward with better marketing. No settlement, Sarah said without turning around. We fight. Jonathan sighed. Then we need to be ready for Kane to get ugly. He's already filed a motion to compel production of all your communications for the past year. Every email, every text message, every phone call. He's looking for evidence you planned this. Good luck with that. Sarah turned back to face the room. I planned to fly undercover for 6 months and observe the culture. I didn't plan on Robert Carson being a racist. He did that all by himself. Still, Jonathan warned, be prepared for your personal life to be dissected. Kane will dig into your background, your relationships, your finances. He'll look for anything to undermine your credibility. Let him dig. I've got nothing to hide. The meeting ended with assignments. Jonathan would handle the legal response, drafting answers to the complaint and preparing for discovery. Kenneth would oversee the forensic audit, pushing the team to deliver preliminary findings in 4 weeks instead of 6. Christopher Blake would manage internal communications, making sure every employee in the company understood the stakes. And Sarah would do what she did best. She'd fly. The schedule Christopher handed her was punishing. 4 transatlantic round trips in 2 weeks, a mix of Frankfurt, London, and Paris routes. Some as captain, some as first officer, all under her legal name now. The secret was out. Every passenger who boarded a Skyward flight knew there was a chance they'd see the CEO in the cockpit. Some found it inspiring. Others found it like a publicity stunt. Sarah didn't care what they thought. She cared about proving she belonged there, that her qualifications weren't a quota checkbox, but the result of 10,000 hours and a lifetime of preparation. On her 3rd trip, London Heathrow, she was paired with a captain named William Davis. Davis was 61, 3 years from mandatory retirement, and had flown with Robert Carson a dozen times. He greeted her in the crew briefing room with a handshake that lasted exactly the professional amount of time and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. First Officer Mitchell, Captain Davis. They ran through the flight plan in near silence, the tension thick enough to taste. Sarah could feel him evaluating her, measuring her against whatever metric he used to separate real pilots from pretenders. The flight to London was textbook. Sarah handled the radios, managed the flight computer, ran the checklists with the precision of a Swiss watch. Davis flew the approach into Heathrow through crosswinds that gusted to 35 knots, the kind of landing that separated veterans from rookies. He greased at the wheels, kissing the runway so gently the passengers probably didn't notice they'd landed. In the crew van to the hotel, Davis finally spoke. "You're a good pilot." Sarah glanced at him. "Thank you." He stared out the window at the gray London suburbs rolling past. "Robert Carson was my friend. We flew together for 15 years, went to each other's kids' weddings, played golf every month." Sarah waited. "He was wrong about you," Davis continued. "Wrong about what he said, wrong about how he treated you. I want you to know I don't condone that." Sarah nodded slowly, but Davis met her eyes. "But did you have to destroy him? You could have fired him quietly, given him a chance to resign with dignity. Let him keep his reputation. You chose to humiliate him in front of 300 people and turn him into a national joke. That wasn't justice, that was revenge." Sarah's voice was soft but unyielding. "Captain Davis, how many times did you fly with Robert Carson and watch him belittle a flight attendant? How many times did you hear him make a racist joke in the cockpit and say nothing? How many junior officers did he run out of this company because you and men like you valued your friendship with him more than you valued doing the right thing?" Davis looked away. "That's what I thought Sarah said. The dignity you're asking me to grant him is the same dignity he denied to dozens of people over 30 years. I didn't take it from him. He threw it away the moment he decided his ego mattered more than basic human decency." They didn't speak again for the rest of the trip, but when they landed back in Chicago 2 days later, Davis stopped her at the crew sign-in desk. "For what it's worth," he muttered, "the company needed someone like you. I just wish it hadn't cost Robert everything." Sarah watched him walk away and felt the familiar ache of knowing she'd done the right thing in the hardest possible way. Doing the right thing shouldn't feel this lonely. But it did. While Sarah was flying the North Atlantic, the media firestorm was reaching critical mass. The original TikTok video from Flight 628 had been viewed 40 million times. News outlets from CNN to Fox to international networks had picked up the story. Talking heads debated whether Sarah was a hero standing up to workplace discrimination or a CEO on a power trip who'd ambushed an employee. Think pieces proliferated. Some praised her courage. Others questioned her methods. A few conspiracy theorists suggested the whole thing had been staged for publicity. The hashtag Skyward CEO trended for 3 days straight. Robert Carson became the face of every conversation about bias in hiring, corporate accountability, and cancel culture. His lawyer, Jeffrey Kane, was more than happy to feed the machine. He gave interviews painting Carson as a dedicated professional railroaded by political correctness. He suggested Sarah had violated Carson's civil rights by secretly recording him, even though it was passengers who'd filmed the confrontation. He hinted darkly at Skyward's maintenance problems and safety shortcuts, never quite making specific allegations, but leaving the impression of an airline cutting corners. Skyward's stock price dipped 4% in a week. And then Gary Stevens showed up. Sarah was in her office on the 42nd floor of the Skyward Tower, working through a mountain of FAA regulatory updates when her assistant buzzed. "Ms. Mitchell, there's a man in the lobby demanding to see you. Gary Stevens. He says he's with the pilots' union." "Send him up," Sarah said. She stood and walked to the windows, watching the Chicago River snake through the canyon of skyscrapers below. Gary Stevens was exactly what she'd expected. Short, thick around the middle, red-faced from exertion or anger or both. Cheap suit, thinning hair, the aggressive posture of a man who'd spent 40 years fighting management and had never learned to stop swinging. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He planted himself in front of her desk and slammed his briefcase down hard enough to rattle her coffee cup. "Where is she? Where's the manager responsible for this disaster?" "You're looking at her," Sarah said calmly. Gary spun to face her, his eyes narrowing in dismissal. "You're the CEO. You look like someone who makes decisions that affect thousands of lives." Sarah finished. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, and you are Gary Stevens, regional rep for the pilots' union. I just got off the phone with Robert Carson, and I'm here to tell you that what you did was a flagrant violation of the collective bargaining agreement section, 14B. If you don't reinstate him immediately, I will shut this airline down. Reinstate a man who violated federal anti-discrimination law on camera." Sarah moved to stand behind her desk. "Mr. Stevens, I think you're confused about what kind of meeting this is." "Confused?" Gary's face reddened further. "I'm not confused. I know exactly what this is. You're some woke CEO trying to make an example out of a good man because he didn't kowtow to your diversity agenda. Robert Carson has 30 years of unblemished service. You can't fire him for one bad day." One bad day, Sarah pulled out her phone and played the video. The same video the whole world had seen. Robert's voice filled the office, dripping with contempt. "Diversity hire, affirmative action, not a real pilot." Gary watched his jaw working like he was chewing glass. When it ended, Sarah set the phone down. "That's not one bad day, Mr. Stevens. That's a man who felt so safe in his bigotry that he broadcast it to 300 witnesses. That's a culture that protected him for so long he thought he was invincible. That's what I'm trying to fix. Alleged bigotry, Gary blustered, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. It's his word against yours. Sarah swiped to another video, this one from a different angle, showing Robert's face twisted in contempt as he pointed at her. Then she swiped again. And again. 6 videos total from 6 different passengers' phones. It's his word against the internet, Mr. Stevens, and the internet has better video quality. Gary's bluster collapsed. He looked around the office as if seeing it for the first time, realizing he'd walked into an ambush of his own making. Okay, look, maybe Robert got a little heated. We can talk about suspension, mandatory sensitivity training, but firing him outright, that's extreme. Mr. Stevens. Sarah's voice could have cut diamonds. You seem to be operating under a misapprehension. You think this is a negotiation between a union representative and middle management. It's not. I own this airline. 67% of voting shares. I don't answer to you. I don't answer to the board. I answer to the FAA, to our passengers, and to my own conscience. Robert Carson will never fly for Skyward again. If the union wants to spend its members' dues defending a man caught on 4K video being an open racist, be my guest. I have deeper pockets than you do. And public opinion is on my side. Gary picked up his briefcase, his movement stiff. We'll see about that in court. You do that, Sarah replied. And while you're at it, ask yourself if this is really the hill you want the union to die on. Because I promise you there are a lot of pilots in this company who are watching this very carefully. They're watching to see if their union protects professionals or shields bullies. Choose wisely. Gary left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Sarah sank into her chair and allowed herself 10 seconds of pure, unfiltered exhaustion. Then her phone rang. Kenneth Reynolds. Turn on CNN, he said without preamble. Sarah grabbed the remote and clicked on the television mounted on her office wall. The chyron at the bottom read, Breaking news, Skyward Airlines CEO fires captain. The anchor, a blonde woman with the kind of perfect hair that defied both gravity and logic, spoke with practiced concern. In a dramatic confrontation this morning at Chicago O'Hare, Skyward Airlines CEO Sarah Mitchell, who had been flying undercover as a pilot, publicly fired Senior Captain Robert Carson for refusing to fly with her. We have exclusive footage. The video played. All 20 million people who'd already seen it watched it again. And then the anchor introduced a new element. The screen split. On the right, the cockpit confrontation. On the left, a live shot of Robert Carson's face, pale and haggard, sitting in what looked like a lawyer's office. Mr. Carson, the anchor's voice oozed sympathy. Tell us what happened from your perspective. Robert's voice was hoarse, broken. I made a mistake. I admit that. I let my frustration get the better of me. But I never intended to hurt anyone. I was concerned about safety, about proper procedures. I didn't know who she was. She set me up. The anchor leaned forward, her expression carefully calibrated to suggest she was asking tough questions while actually lobbing softballs. Set you up how Ms. Mitchell knew who I was. She knew I was a senior captain with 3 decades of experience, but she hid her identity. She let me make assumptions, let me walk into a trap, and then she humiliated me in front of the whole world. Not because I was wrong, but because I was politically inconvenient. Sarah's hands clenched on the armrests of her chair. She wanted to scream at the television, to call the network and demand equal time. But she forced herself to watch. Robert continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his narrative. I've given my life to Skyward Airlines. I've flown through storms that would ground lesser pilots. I've brought thousands of passengers home safely. I've mentored young aviators, helped them earn their wings. And in one moment, one mistake born of concern for safety, I lost everything. My career, my reputation, my pension, my marriage is in shambles. My children won't speak to me. All because I questioned someone's qualifications in a moment of stress. Is that justice? The anchor turned to the camera, her face a mask of performative concern. A question many are asking tonight. Has workplace accountability gone too far? When does justice become vengeance? We'll be right back. Sarah turned off the television. Her phone was already ringing again. Jonathan Harris. I saw it, Sarah said before he could speak. Kane's playing the sympathy card, making Carson out to be a victim of political correctness run amok. It's effective, Jonathan admitted. Our polling shows public opinion is shifting. 48% of respondents now believe you overreacted. 31% support your decision. 21% are undecided. Those are bad numbers, Sarah. We're not running for office. We're running an airline. I don't care what polls say. I care about what's right. Jonathan's voice carried the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a child who insisted 2 + 2 = 5. Sarah, in a lawsuit, public opinion matters. It affects jury pools. It affects settlements. It affects your ability to lead this company. If the narrative becomes, you're a vindictive CEO, we lose ground on every front. Then we change the narrative, Sarah said. How? Find me what Robert Carson is hiding. Find me the reason he thought he was untouchable. Because men like him aren't just bigots, they're corrupt. The two go hand in hand. Someone who thinks the rules don't apply socially thinks the rules don't apply professionally. I'd stake my career on it. You are staking your career on it, Jonathan replied. And if we don't find anything, Kane wins by default. So find something. Sarah ended the call and stared at her reflection in the dark television screen. She looked older than 34, the lines around her eyes deeper, her expression harder. Her father had looked like that in his last year, worn down by the weight of keeping an airline running while knowing the foundation was rotten. She understood now why he'd asked her to fly instead of rule. You couldn't see the cracks from the executive suite. You had to be down in the machinery in the cockpit and the terminals and the crew lounges to understand how deep the rot ran. 3 weeks passed. Thanksgiving came and went. Sarah spent it alone in her Lincoln Park condo eating takeout Chinese and reviewing financial reports. Her mother, Karen Mitchell, had called from her retirement home in Scottsdale. You're working too hard, sweetheart. Your father did the same thing. It killed him. I'm fine, Mom. You're not fine. You're in every newspaper and on every channel. People are saying terrible things. Let them talk. I'm doing what Dad asked me to do. He asked you to fix the company, not to crucify yourself. Come to Arizona for Christmas. Rest. Maybe. I'll think about it. She knew she wouldn't go. There was too much to do. The forensic audit was entering its 4th week. Kenneth sent daily updates. The team had reviewed 10 years of Robert Carson's flight logs, cross-referencing them with fuel receipts, maintenance records, and expense reports. They were looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that didn't fit. So far, nothing. Carson had been careful. Or he'd been clean. Sarah was betting on careful. On the legal front, Kane had filed a motion for expedited discovery. Jonathan had opposed it, arguing Skyward needed time to prepare. The judge split the difference. Discovery would begin in January. Depositions would start in February. Trial was set for May. 5 months. 5 months to prove that Robert Carson was more than just a bigot, that he was a criminal. 5 months to save her father's legacy from being dismantled by lawyers and talking heads. Sarah threw herself into flying, logging more hours than any CEO in aviation history. She flew Boston to London, she flew Miami to Frankfurt, she flew Los Angeles to Paris. Every flight was perfect, every landing by the book, every interaction with her crew professional and courteous. Slowly, grudgingly, the pilots began to accept her. Not all of them. Some still thought she was a publicity stunt. But enough of them saw she could fly, that she belonged in the cockpit, that her stripes weren't decorative. And then, 6 days before Christmas, Kenneth called. We found it. Sarah was in her office reviewing Q4 revenue projections. She nearly dropped the phone. Found what? The smoking gun. Get Jonathan and meet me in the boardroom in 30 minutes. Bring coffee. This is going to take a while. The boardroom was already set up when Sarah arrived. A projector screen glowed at the far end of the table. Spread across the mahogany surface were stacks of documents, spreadsheets, photographs, and what looked like email printouts. Kenneth stood at the head of the table with Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the lead forensic accountant, A sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with the intensity of someone who found spreadsheet anomalies more exciting than most people found action movies. Jonathan arrived 30 seconds later, his tie loosened and his expression wary. "What do we have?" Rebecca clicked a button on her laptop. The screen filled with a spreadsheet. "Captain Carson didn't steal fuel," she began. That was a dead end. "But he did steal. Just not the way we expected." She clicked again. The screen showed a series of wire transfers, each for amounts ranging from $10,000 to $25,000. The dates went back 7 years. The source was listed as Horizon Parts and Supply, a company registered in Miami. Over 7 years, Captain Carson received $1.8 million in cash payments from this company, Rebecca said. The money was wired to an account in the Cayman Islands, then transferred to a Shell LLC registered in Delaware, then finally moved to Carson's personal accounts in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting. Sarah leaned forward. "What was he selling them?" "Access," Rebecca replied. She pulled up another document, an email chain between Robert Carson and a man named Stephen Cruz listed as CEO of Horizon Parts and Supply. The first email was dated 2018. The subject line read, "Rehydraulic Seal Specifications." Sarah's chest tightened as Rebecca read aloud. "Robert, the hydraulic seals we discussed are 40% cheaper than OEM Boeing parts. If you can get Skyward Maintenance to approve them for installation on your regular rotation aircraft, there's a $15,000 finder's fee in it for you." The next email, sent 3 days later, was Robert's response. "Stephen, I'll push for approval on N847SK. I fly that bird twice a week. Wire the usual to the account." Rebecca clicked through more emails. Dozens of them. Fuel pumps, avionics components, landing gear bushings. Every time the same pattern. Stephen Cruz would pitch a cheaper aftermarket part. Robert Carson would recommend it to Skyward's maintenance department, leveraging his status as senior captain to influence purchasing decisions. And every time money would flow. Sarah felt sick. These parts were, they safe? Rebecca pulled up a photograph. It showed a hydraulic seal cracked and degraded. This seal was removed from aircraft N847SK during a routine inspection last month. It's a Horizon Parts product. FAA approved technically, but barely within tolerances. If it had failed during flight, she paused, letting the implication hang. "Hydraulic system failure," Jonathan finished. "Loss of flight controls. 300 people dead." Rebecca nodded, and Carson knew. "We found his flight logs. He flew N847SK 43 times after Horizon Parts were installed. He put passengers on that aircraft knowing it had substandard components because refusing the plane would trigger an investigation." Kenneth picked up the narrative. "It gets worse. Carson didn't just take kickbacks. He falsified records to hide the scheme." Rebecca clicked to another document, a weight and balance sheet for a flight to Bangkok. Carson would order the correct amount of fuel, but then report slightly higher amounts on the official logs. The discrepancy was small, a few hundred pounds. When challenged, he'd claim he dumped excess fuel as a safety precaution. In reality, there was no excess fuel. He was creating paperwork trails to justify the cash deposits. "So he ran 2 schemes simultaneously," Sarah said slowly. "Parts kickbacks and fuel fraud." "Exactly," Rebecca confirmed. "Total take over 7 years, $1.8 million. "And the risk he created?" Jonathan asked. "Catastrophic," Rebecca said bluntly. "We're talking about multiple federally regulated safety violations, wire fraud, falsifying FAA documents, reckless endangerment of an aircraft. This is Title 18 territory. Federal prison, decades, not years." Sarah stood and walked to the windows. The city lights stretched out below a constellation of human endeavor and ambition. Somewhere down there, Robert Carson was probably sitting in his lawyer's office, probably rehearsing his victim narrative for the next CNN interview, probably thinking he'd won. "Do we have enough for criminal charges?" she asked without turning around. "More than enough," Jonathan replied. "The emails alone are smoking guns. Add in the wire transfers, the falsified logs, the physical evidence of substandard parts. We have an airtight case. The question is, do we want to go there?" Sarah turned back. "What do you mean?" Jonathan clasped his hands on the table. Right now, this is a civil lawsuit about wrongful termination. If we refer this to the FBI, it becomes a federal criminal investigation. Carson goes to prison, but it also means months of media coverage, FAA investigations, potential fines for Skyward for not catching it sooner. Our maintenance department gets audited top to bottom. It's messy. How messy? Tens of millions in legal costs, Kenneth said. Potential regulatory sanctions. And the optics of admitting our senior captain was running a corruption scheme under our noses for 7 years. The board won't love it. Sarah looked at the photograph of the cracked hydraulic seal. She thought about the passengers on Flight 628, the businessman who'd thanked her for inspiring his daughter, the elderly woman who'd pressed a phone number into her hand. She thought about all the flights Robert Carson had piloted with compromised parts, all the lives he'd gambled with for $15,000. "Call the FBI," she said. Sarah Kenneth started, but she cut him off. "Call them. This isn't about the lawsuit anymore. This isn't about optics or stock prices. Robert Carson endangered 300 people at a time 43 times because he wanted a bigger boat. If we bury this to protect ourselves, we're as guilty as he is." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I'll reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We'll need to coordinate. They'll want everything. Every document, every email, every wire transfer. This becomes their investigation, not ours." "Good," Sarah said. "Let them have it. And Jonathan. When they arrest him, I want to be there." 2 weeks later, on a gray January morning that threatened snow, Sarah sat in the back of a black SUV outside Jeffrey Kane's law office in downtown Chicago. Next to her sat Special Agent Jennifer Cole, the FBI's lead investigator on the Carson case. In the front seat, 2 more agents reviewed the arrest warrant on a tablet. They'd moved fast. The U.S. Attorney had convened a grand jury in 10 days, presented the evidence Rebecca Walsh had compiled, and secured indictments on 14 counts, including wire fraud, falsifying federal documents, and reckless endangerment of aircraft in violation of Title 18. The arrest warrant had been signed yesterday. Robert Carson didn't know it yet, but his victim tour was about to end. "He thinks this is a settlement meeting," Jennifer said, checking her watch. "Kane told him Skyward was ready to negotiate. Told him to be here at 10 a.m. It's 10:02. Let's go." They walked into the building's lobby, badged their way past security, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Kane's office was exactly what Sarah expected. Expensive furniture, too much marble floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the Chicago River. The receptionist's eyes went wide when she saw the FBI jackets. "Conference room 3, she stammered, pointing. Jennifer didn't knock. She pushed open the door. Robert Carson sat at a long table, feet propped up on the polished wood, wearing a new suit that probably cost $3,000. Jeffrey Kane sat across from him, scrolling through his phone. Both men looked up. Robert saw Sarah first. His face went through a rapid succession of emotions. Confusion, recognition, anger, and then, as his eyes tracked to the FBI agents behind her, fear. "What is this?" Kane was on his feet, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "This is a settlement meeting. You can't bring federal agents." "This isn't a settlement meeting," Sarah said, her voice cold and clear. She stepped aside, letting Jennifer move forward. "This is an arrest." Robert stood slowly, his chair scraping back. The color drained from his face. Jennifer pulled a folded document from her jacket. "Robert Carson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, grand larceny, and endangerment of aircraft in violation of Title 18 of the United States Code." She nodded to the agents flanking her. Handcuffs clicked in the quiet room. Robert Kane started reaching for his briefcase, but Jennifer cut him off. "Mr. Kane, if you're representing Mr. Carson, you can meet him at the federal courthouse for arraignment. We're taking him into custody now." Robert's hands were pulled behind his back. The metal cuffs closed with a sound like finality. He looked at Sarah, his eyes desperate. "Ms. Mitchell, please, this is a mistake. I can explain. The parts were approved. Everyone does it. I have a family, grandchildren. You can't do this." Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the fear in his eyes, close enough to smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the sweat. "You said you have a family. 300 passengers on every flight you flew also had families. You didn't think about them when you pocketed $15,000. You didn't think about them when you signed off on substandard parts. You gambled with their lives. Now you get to live with that." The agents led him toward the door. Robert tried to pull back, his voice rising to a shout. "This isn't right. I'm a captain. I have rights." "You had responsibilities," Sarah called after him. "You betrayed every single one of them." The door closed. Jeffrey Kane stood alone in his conference room, staring at the file folder Sarah had placed on the table. Inside were copies of every email, every wire transfer, every falsified document. He opened it, scanned the first page, and his face went gray. "I'm withdrawing as counsel," he said quietly. "I don't represent federal defendants." "Smart choice," Sarah replied. She walked out, leaving Kane to his crisis of professional ethics. In the SUV, Jennifer turned to Sarah. "How do you feel?" Sarah thought about the question. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt tired and sad and grimly satisfied that the system for once had worked the way it was supposed to. "I feel like I can breathe again," she said finally. "Like the rot is finally cut out." Jennifer nodded. "The arraignment's tomorrow. He'll plead not guilty. His public defender will try to negotiate. But with this evidence, he's looking at 12 to 15 years minimum." "Good," Sarah said. "Let him have a long time to think about what he threw away." The SUV pulled away from the curb. Through the tinted windows, Sarah watched the city slide past, the same city her father had loved, the same skyline he'd flown over for 40 years. "Cha-oi," she thought, "Khan de Lamduk. I did it. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but I cut out the cancer. Now maybe we can heal." That evening, every major news network led with the same story. Breaking Skyward Airlines, captain arrested on federal charges. The footage showed Robert Carson being led from the federal courthouse in handcuffs, his head down, his expensive suit rumpled. The anchor's voice was solemn, the tone completely different from the sympathetic interview 2 weeks earlier. Captain Robert Carson, fired last month by Skyward Airlines CEO Sarah Mitchell for discriminatory conduct, has been arrested on federal corruption charges. Court documents allege Carson accepted nearly $2 million in kickbacks from an aviation parts supplier and falsified safety records, potentially endangering thousands of passengers. The screen split. On one side, the video from Flight 628. On the other, a photograph of the cracked hydraulic seal. "If these allegations are proven," the anchor continued, "they paint a picture not of a dedicated professional, unfairly targeted, but of a pilot who prioritized personal profit over passenger safety. It's a stunning reversal in a case that has captivated the nation." Sarah watched from her office. Her phone rang. "Kenneth Reynolds. The board wants to issue a statement." "What do you want to say?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Say this. At Skyward Airlines, safety and integrity are non-negotiable. When we learned of potential criminal conduct, we immediately referred the matter to federal authorities. We will cooperate fully with the investigation, and we will continue to hold every employee at every level to the highest standards of professionalism and ethics. No exceptions." Kenneth was quiet for a beat. "That's perfect. You should give the statement yourself. Press conference tomorrow." "No," Sarah said. "Let Jonathan do it. I'm just a pilot. I don't want this to be about me." "It is about you," Kenneth replied gently. "You're the face of the company now. People need to hear from you. Then they can hear from me in the cockpit," Sarah said. "Schedule me for the Frankfurt route tomorrow. I want to fly. You just took down a corrupt pilot and handed the FBI a federal case. You don't need to prove anything else." "I'm not proving anything," Sarah said. "I'm doing my job. There's a difference." She hung up and stared at the city lights. Somewhere down there, Robert Carson was sitting in a federal holding cell, trading his captain's uniform for an orange jumpsuit. His wife had filed for divorce. His children had disowned him. His pension was frozen pending the outcome of the criminal trial. His name would be taught in aviation safety courses as a cautionary tale for generations. And Sarah felt no joy in it. Only the grim satisfaction of a surgeon who'd cut out a tumor. It had to be done. But that didn't make it pleasant. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago smelled like old wood and broken promises. Sarah sat in the back row of the gallery, watching Robert Carson shuffle into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. 4 months in pretrial detention had stripped 30 pounds from him, hollowed out his cheeks, turned his skin the color of old newspaper. He didn't look like the Silver Hawk anymore. He looked like a man who'd aged a decade in a season. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Voss, reviewed the charges with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd presided over 1,000 arraignments. Count 1, wire fraud. Count 2 through 7, falsifying federal aviation documents. Count 8 through 14, reckless endangerment of aircraft. How does the defendant plead? Robert's public defender, a young man named Thomas Chen, who looked fresh out of law school, stood. Not guilty, Your Honor. We request bail pending trial. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named Elizabeth Warner, rose smoothly. The government opposes bail. The defendant has substantial financial resources hidden in offshore accounts. He's a flight risk in the most literal sense. He holds an airline transport pilot license. He has contacts internationally. And the evidence of his crimes shows a pattern of prioritizing personal gain over public safety. We believe he poses a danger if released. Judge Voss didn't hesitate. Bail denied. Trial is set for May 15th. She banged her gavel. Robert's shoulders slumped. Thomas Chen leaned in to whisper something, probably about appeals, probably about strategy. But Robert wasn't listening. His eyes swept the gallery until they found Sarah. For 3 seconds they stared at each other across the courtroom. Then Robert looked away first, and the marshals led him back through the side door to whatever cell awaited him. Sarah walked out into the April rain feeling nothing. No victory, no vindication. Just the hollow awareness that justice, when it finally arrived, rarely felt like the movies promised it would. Jonathan Harris was waiting under the courthouse awning, his umbrella fighting a losing battle with the wind. The jury selection starts Monday. Warner thinks we'll have a panel seated by Wednesday. Opening statements Thursday. How long is the trial expected to run? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Warner's bringing 47 exhibits and 16 witnesses. She's building this case like a cathedral, brick by brick. No room for reasonable doubt. Sarah pulled her coat tighter against the cold. What are his chances of acquittal? Jonathan's laugh was humorless. 0. Of a plea deal, maybe 20%. But he'd have to admit to the crimes in open court. Warner wants 10 years minimum. Robert's attorney will try to negotiate down to 7, maybe 8. Either way, he's going to prison. Good, Sarah said. She meant it. 2 months had passed since the arrest. 2 months of depositions and discovery of lawyers dissecting every email and wire transfer of forensic accountants testifying before grand juries. The civil lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice the day after Robert's indictment. Jeffrey Kane had quietly refunded Robert's retainer and stopped returning his calls. The union had issued a carefully worded statement distancing itself from Carson while still defending the collective bargaining process. Gary Stevens had retired early. Public opinion had swung so dramatically that Sarah stopped reading the comments. Where she'd once been called vindictive, she was now hailed as a hero. Where Robert had been painted as a victim, he was now universally reviled. She didn't trust either narrative. Heroes didn't spend sleepless nights wondering if they'd destroyed a man too thoroughly. Villains didn't usually have grandchildren who sent them letters in prison. The trial began on a Thursday morning in May, with temperatures already climbing into the 80s. Sarah attended every day, sitting in the same back row watching the machinery of federal prosecution grind through the evidence. Elizabeth Warner was methodical, almost surgical. She called FAA inspectors who testified about the substandard horizon parts. She called forensic accountants who walked the jury through the money trail showing how cash flowed from Stephen Cruz to Robert Carson in exchange for maintenance approvals. She called passengers who'd flown on N847SK, ordinary people who wept on the stand talking about their children, their parents, the lives they'd entrusted to a pilot who'd valued his boat payment over their safety. Robert's defense was thin to the point of transparency. Thomas Chen argued entrapment, claiming Stephen Cruz had pressured Carson into the scheme. He suggested the parts were technically FAA approved, that Carson had relied on expert assurances of safety. He painted his client as a dedicated aviator who'd made poor financial decisions under stress but never intended to harm anyone. The jury didn't buy it. Sarah could see it in their faces, the way they leaned back when Robert took the stand, the way they wouldn't meet his eyes. On the 7th day of testimony, Warner called her star witness. Stephen Cruz, himself granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, walked into the courtroom wearing an expensive suit and the expression of a man who'd sold his soul and gotten a good price for it. "Mr. Cruz," Warner began, "how did you first approach Captain Carson about this arrangement?" Stephen's voice was smooth, practiced. "I'd been selling aftermarket parts to airlines for 15 years. I knew that senior captains had influence over purchasing decisions. Carson had a reputation. People said he was flexible, that he understood how the business worked." "And what did that mean, flexible?" "It meant he'd take cash to push inferior products if the price was right," Stephen said flatly. "I offered him $15,000 for his first approval. He negotiated up to $20,000. After that, it was just business." "How many transactions did you conduct with Captain Carson over 7 years?" 63, Stephen replied. "Total payout, $1.8 million. "And did Captain Carson ever express concern about the safety of the parts you were providing?" Stephen's smile was thin and cruel. "Once. About 3 years in. He asked if the hydraulic seals would hold up under stress. I told him they were within FAA minimums. He asked if that meant they were safe. I said they were legal. He said that was good enough. He took the money." The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's fingers on the keys. Sarah watched Robert, saw his head drop, saw his shoulders shake. Thomas Chen tried to rehabilitate on cross-examination, suggesting Stephen was lying to save himself. But the emails were there. The wire transfers were there. The cracked seal was there, mounted on a display board like evidence at a murder trial. On day 9, the defense rested without calling additional witnesses. Thomas Chen gave a closing argument that was more eulogy than advocacy, asking the jury for mercy, for understanding that good people sometimes made terrible mistakes. Warner's closing was fire. She held up a photograph of the cracked seal. "This," she told the jury, "is what Robert Carson thought your lives were worth. $15,000, the price of a used car. He sat in that cockpit with 300 souls behind him, knowing the aircraft had compromised parts. And he flew anyway, because his boat payment was due, because his country club membership needed renewal, because he decided his comfort mattered more than your children's lives." The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Robert Carson didn't react when the verdict was read. He sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, staring at nothing. The marshals took him away. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sarah like locusts. "Ms. Mitchell, how do you feel about the verdict? Justice was served. Do you think the sentence will be harsh enough? I trust Judge Voss to impose an appropriate punishment. This has been called a landmark case for corporate accountability. Do you think it will change aviation culture?" Sarah stopped and looked directly into the cameras. "Culture doesn't change because of one trial. It changes when good people stop accepting silence as an excuse for complicity. It changes when we decide integrity matters more than convenience. At Skyward Airlines, we've decided. I hope the rest of the industry follows." She walked away before they could ask more questions. Sentencing day arrived in late June. The courtroom was packed. Victim impact statements had been submitted by 47 passengers who'd flown on N847SK during the period when compromised parts were installed. Judge Voss read selections aloud. A mother describing her 8-year-old daughter's fear of flying, how she'd held her hand during takeoff on that aircraft, how learning about Carson's crimes had given the child nightmares. A businessman who'd written his will before a flight standard precaution, who now wondered if Robert Carson had been his pilot, and whether that precaution had almost become necessary. An elderly couple who'd celebrated their 50th anniversary in Paris, flown there by Carson, who said they'd never feel safe in an airplane again. Robert was given a chance to speak. He stood, his jumpsuit hanging like a shroud, and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong. I know I betrayed the trust of every passenger who flew with me. I let greed cloud my judgment. I convinced myself the parts were safe enough, that the risks were minimal, that I was entitled to the money because of my years of service. I was wrong about all of it." His voice cracked. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want the court to know that I think about those flights every day. Every single one. And I'm grateful, so grateful that none of those seals failed, that none of those parts gave out. Because if they had, If even one person had died because of my choices, I couldn't live with it. I can barely live with what I did as it is." Judge Voss let the silence stretch. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. "Mr. Carson, the court acknowledges your remorse. But remorse doesn't undo the danger you created. It doesn't give back the sense of safety you stole from the passengers who trusted you. You were given an extraordinary responsibility. People put their lives in your hands every time you sat in that cockpit, and you betrayed them, not once in a moment of weakness, but 63 times over 7 years. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. That's a choice." She opened a folder. "The sentencing guidelines for your crime suggest 8 to 12 years. The government has recommended 12. Your counsel has requested 7. The court finds that neither adequately reflects the severity of your conduct or the need to deter others in positions of similar trust." She looked directly at Robert. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 14 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before 10 years served. In addition, you will forfeit all assets obtained through the criminal enterprise totaling $1.8 million. Your pilot's license is permanently revoked, and upon release you will be prohibited from employment in any safety-sensitive transportation role for the remainder of your life." The gavel fell. Robert Carson's legs buckled. The marshals caught him before he hit the floor. Thomas Chen was already on his feet filing notice of appeal, but everyone in the courtroom knew it was futile. The evidence was overwhelming. The sentence was within guidelines. Robert Carson would die in prison, if not literally, then metaphorically, his identity stripped away along with his freedom. Sarah walked out of the courthouse into summer sunshine that felt obscene in its brightness. She'd won. Robert Carson would spend the next decade behind bars. Skyward Airlines had been vindicated. The FAA had launched a comprehensive audit of maintenance practices and found the company in full compliance aside from Carson's scheme. The stock price had recovered and then climbed, hitting all-time highs as investors praised Sarah's leadership. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt exhausted. Kenneth Reynolds found her sitting on a bench in the park across from the courthouse, watching pigeons fight over a discarded sandwich. 14 years, he said, sitting down beside her. "That's a life sentence for a man his age. He'll be 74 when he's eligible for parole." Sarah didn't respond. "He earned it," Kenneth continued. "Every year. What he did was monstrous." "I know. Then why do you look like you just lost?" "Because I keep thinking about his grandchildren. They didn't do anything wrong. They just had a grandfather who was a monster. And now they'll grow up with that shame." Kenneth was quiet for a long moment. "Your father used to say that the hardest part of running an airline wasn't the regulations or the competition. It was knowing that every decision you made affected thousands of lives in ways you'd never see. You fire someone, their kids lose their house. You ground a fleet, mechanics lose work. There's no such thing as a clean choice. You just try to make the least bad one." "Was this the least bad choice?" Sarah asked. "Or did I destroy a man because he humiliated me?" "You destroyed a man because he endangered 300 people at a time, 43 times for money," Kenneth replied. "The humiliation was just what forced you to look close enough to find it. If anything, you should feel guilty for not finding it sooner." Sarah managed a weak smile. "That's not as comforting as you think it is." Kenneth stood brushing pigeon feathers off his slacks. "Come on. The board wants to have a celebration dinner. Champagne speeches, probably a plaque. You should be there. I don't want to celebrate. You don't have to want it. But you need to show your face. Let people see you standing tall. Leadership is theater, remember." Sarah let him pull her to her feet. They walked back toward the Skyward Tower, toward the executive suite where her father had spent 40 years making impossible choices and living with the consequences. She was starting to understand why he'd looked so tired in those last months, why he'd asked her to fly instead of rule. The view from the cockpit was so much cleaner than the view from the corner office. That night, Sarah stood in the boardroom with a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking, accepting congratulations from board members and executives who'd spent the last 6 months terrified she was going to destroy the company. They were relieved now, magnanimous in victory, eager to claim they'd supported her all along. Christopher Blake approached with a genuine smile. The pilot corps is requesting a meeting. They want to thank you personally. For what? For proving that skill matters more than seniority. For showing that the rules apply to everyone. You've got young pilots, women, people of color who actually believe they have a future here now. That's because of you. Sarah set down her champagne untouched. Set it up. I'll meet with them. But Christopher, I want it to be a conversation, not a coronation. I don't want them thinking I'm some kind of savior. I'm just trying to run an airline. You are running it, Christopher replied. Better than anyone has in 20 years. Your father would be proud. Sarah's throat tightened. She excused herself and slipped out of the boardroom, taking the elevator down to the lobby and then walking out into the Chicago night. The city hummed around her, traffic and voices and the distant wail of sirens. She walked without direction, letting her feet carry her through downtown and eventually to the river, where she stood on a bridge and watched the water slide past like liquid midnight. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. I saw the news. Are you okay? Sarah typed back. I don't know. Call me when you're ready to talk. I love you. Sarah pocketed the phone. She wasn't ready to talk. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready to articulate the hollow ache that came from doing the right thing and feeling no joy in it. But she'd learned something in the last 6 months, something her father had probably known all along. Justice wasn't supposed to feel good. It was supposed to feel necessary. 3 months later, on a September morning with autumn just beginning to crisper the air, Sarah stood in front of 15,000 Skyward employees assembled via video conference. The company's annual all-hands meeting had always been a production, but this year felt different. There was electricity in the air, anticipation, the sense that something fundamental had shifted. Sarah wore her captain's uniform, 4 gold stripes on her shoulders, the weight of them both literal and metaphorical. She'd earned those stripes in simulators and cockpits, in early mornings and late nights, in 10,000 hours of proving she belonged. But she'd also earned them in courtrooms and boardrooms, in the messy work of cutting out rot and trying to plant something healthier in its place. Good morning. She spoke without notes, the camera focused on her face. 6 months ago, I stood in this same spot and told you that Skyward Airlines was changing, that we were going to prioritize integrity over convenience, safety over profit, and people over politics. Some of you believed me. Some of you were skeptical. And some of you probably thought I was going to destroy the company my father built. She paused, letting the words settle. I want to talk today about what we've actually built together, because this isn't about me. It's about every pilot who's reported a safety concern without fear of retaliation. Every mechanic who's refused to sign off on substandard work. Every flight attendant who stood up to a captain who crossed a line. Culture doesn't change from the top down. It changes when people at every level decide they're not going to accept the old way anymore. The screen behind her lit up with statistics. Pilot applications up 150%, with women and minorities representing 60% of new hires. Safety reports up 40%, not because the airline had become less safe, but because people felt empowered to speak up. Customer satisfaction scores at an all-time high. Stock price up 34% since January. But here's what I'm most proud of, Sarah continued. The screen changed to show a photograph of Laura Price in a new uniform, the insignia of Director of In-Flight Services on her collar. Laura Price completed our crew assertiveness training program with the highest scores in the class. She now leads a department of 3,000 flight attendants, and she's implementing programs to ensure that what happened to her, the pressure to stay silent in the face of abuse, never happens to anyone else. The image changed again, this time showing a young woman in a pilot's uniform. Nicole Chen was a flight attendant 2 years ago. She applied for our scholarship program for underrepresented groups in aviation. She just earned her commercial pilot's license, and next month she'll begin training as a first officer. In 5 years, she'll be a captain. The applause from the 15,000 employees was visible in the chat scroll, a cascade of emojis and affirmations. But Sarah raised a hand for quiet. I also want to talk about Robert Carson. The room went silent, virtual and real. Because it would be easy to make him a villain and move on. To say he was one bad apple and pretend the problem was isolated. But that's not the truth. The truth is that Robert Carson was a product of a culture that rewarded arrogance and punished vulnerability. A culture that confused cruelty with strength, that let senior employees believe the rules didn't apply to them. And that culture wasn't created by one man. It was created by decades of good people staying silent, of looking the other way, of valuing stability over justice. Sarah's voice hardened. Carson is in prison and he deserves to be there. But if we don't change the systems that enabled him, we're just waiting for the next Robert Carson to emerge. So here's what we're doing. The screen filled with policy announcements. The Carson Rule: mandatory reporting for all safety and ethical violations with protection against retaliation. Blind promotion reviews, where panels evaluated pilots based solely on flight records and performance metrics with names and photos removed. Quarterly culture audits conducted by third-party firms. A $10 million annual scholarship fund for underrepresented groups in aviation. And here's what I'm asking from you, Sarah continued. Don't stay silent. If you see something wrong, speak up. If someone treats you with disrespect, report it. If you're asked to compromise safety for convenience, refuse. We've built systems to protect you. Use them. Because Skyward Airlines only works if every one of us, from the CEO to the newest hire, believes that integrity is non-negotiable. The meeting ended to another wave of virtual applause. Sarah stepped away from the camera and slumped into a chair, the adrenaline draining out of her like water from a broken dam. Kenneth approached with a bottle of water. That was perfect. You've got them believing. Do you believe, Sarah asked, accepting the water? In what? That we've actually changed. That this isn't just performative. Kenneth considered the question. 6 months ago I would have said culture change takes years, maybe decades. But I've watched you fire a captain in front of 300 people. I've watched you turn down a settlement that would have made everything easier. I've watched you send a man to prison and then stand up in front of the company and take responsibility for the systems that created him. So, yes, I believe. And more importantly, they believe. That's all that matters. Sarah flew the next day a routine Frankfurt run with a first officer named David Park, who'd been with Skyward for 6 years. They ran through the pre-flight checklist with easy familiarity, the kind of rhythm that came from thousands of hours in cockpits. As they pushed back from the gate, David glanced over. "Can I ask you something?" Captain Sarah nodded, her hands moving through the startup sequence. "When you were undercover, did you ever fly with me?" "Twice," Sarah replied. "Boston to London in March, Miami to Frankfurt in April." David was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know. That was the point." Did I ever?" He struggled for words. "Did you ever make me feel unwelcome?" Sarah finished. "No, David. You were professional, respectful, competent. You're exactly the kind of pilot I want flying for this airline." He exhaled. "I've been thinking a lot about Carson, about how many times I probably flew with him and didn't say anything when he was inappropriate. I should have spoken up." The plane began to roll, taxiing toward runway 28R. "You're speaking up now," Sarah said. "That's what matters." They flew to Frankfurt in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. When they landed, David turned to her as they shut down the engines. "Thank you." "For what?" "For making it safe to care. That's all any of us wanted. The chance to do the job right without worrying about politics or who we were supposed to impress. You gave us that." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of doubt that had been there since the trial. "I'm just trying to fly the plane, David. Same as you." "Yeah," he grinned. "But you're flying the whole airline. That's got to be harder." 6 weeks later, Sarah received a letter forwarded from Skyward's legal department. The return address was Federal Correctional Institution, Terre Haute, Indiana. She stared at it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was shaky, the letters cramped. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to care. But my therapist says I need to write it anyway for my own recovery. So here it is. I'm sorry. Not sorry I got caught. Sorry for what I did. I've had a lot of time to think in here, and I finally understand what you tried to tell me in that courthouse. I didn't just betray passengers. I betrayed the idea of what a pilot is supposed to be. Someone people trust with their lives. Someone who puts safety above everything else. I threw that away for money I didn't need, to buy things I didn't care about. My wife is gone. My children won't visit. My grandkids will grow up thinking I'm a monster. And maybe I am. But I want you to know that what you did, firing me, prosecuting me, sending me here, it was right. I hated you for it. I still hate you sometimes when I'm lying awake at 3 a.m. on a metal bunk. But it was right. You did what someone should have done 20 years ago. Maybe if they had, I wouldn't be here. I don't know if you believe in redemption. I'm not sure I do anymore. But if I ever get out of here, I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to undo some of the damage I caused. I'm working with the FAA to identify other pilots who might be taking kickbacks. I'm teaching safety courses to inmates. It's not much. It's probably not enough. But it's what I can do. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me anything. I just wanted you to know that the person who walked into that cockpit at O'Hare and called you a diversity hire, he's dead. He died in this cell. What's left is someone trying to figure out how to be human again. Robert Carson. Sarah read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't know if she believed in redemption either. But she believed in the possibility of change and the idea that people could learn and grow even in the worst circumstances. She wouldn't write back. That door was closed. But she also wouldn't throw the letter away. It was evidence that accountability wasn't just about punishment. It was about the space punishment created for reflection, for reckoning, for the chance to become someone better. 2 years later, on a crisp October morning, Sarah stood on the tarmac at O'Hare, watching the sun rise over the terminal buildings. Beside her stood 50 newly graduated pilots, 28 women, 34 people of color, all wearing crisp uniforms and expressions that mixed terror and exhilaration. This was the third class to graduate from the Skyward Pathways program, the scholarship initiative that had taken mechanics and flight attendants and baristas with dreams and turned them into commercial pilots. Nicole Chen stood in the front row now, a full first officer with 200 hours on the 787. She caught Sarah's eye and grinned. "You ready?" Sarah asked the assembled group. They nodded a chorus of "Yes, ma'am," and "Absolutely," and "Let's do this." Remember what I told you in ground school. Flying is the easy part. The hard part is maintaining your integrity when you're tired, when you're pressured, when someone tells you to cut corners. The hard part is speaking up when you see something wrong. The hard part is being the kind of pilot people trust not just with their lives, but with their children's lives. She paused, looking at their young faces, seeing her own reflection from a decade ago. My father used to say that power doesn't come from the stripes on your shoulder or the controls in your hand. It comes from doing the right thing when doing the wrong thing would be easier. You're about to have power. 300 people will put their lives in your hands every time you fly. Don't ever forget the weight of that. Don't ever take it for granted. And if you ever find yourself choosing between your convenience and their safety, choose them. Every single time. The graduates applauded. Sarah shook hands with each of them, remembering their names, their stories, the obstacles they'd overcome to stand on this tarmac. When Nicole reached her, the younger woman's eyes were bright with tears. "Thank you for believing I could do this." "I didn't believe you could do this," Sarah replied. "I knew you could. There's a difference. You just had to prove it to yourself." Nicole nodded and moved on. Sarah watched them board the buses that would take them to their first assignments scattered across Skyward's network. Some would fly domestic routes, building hours. Others would start on international runs, jumping straight into the deep end. All of them would face challenges, discrimination moments when they'd be underestimated or dismissed. But they'd also have support systems that hadn't existed 2 years ago. They'd have reporting mechanisms that worked. They'd have a CEO who'd proven she'd burn the place down before letting another Robert Carson flourish. Kenneth Reynolds appeared at her elbow. That was well done. Sarah watched the buses pull away. "You think they'll make it?" All of them no. Some will wash out. Some will decide flying isn't for them. Some will make mistakes and learn from them. Some won't learn. But enough will make it to change the face of this industry. That's all we can ask for. "Is it enough?" Sarah turned to face him. "Is it enough to balance what we destroyed?" "You didn't destroy Robert Carson," Kenneth replied. "You stopped him from destroying anyone else. There's a difference. The same difference you told Nicole about. Knowing versus believing." Sarah nodded slowly. They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning haze. Somewhere in Indiana, Robert Carson was waking up in a cell. Somewhere in Chicago, Laura Price was leading a staff meeting teaching flight attendants how to speak up. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a Skyward 787 was cruising at 37,000 feet with a woman at the controls. And here on this tarmac, Sarah Mitchell felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction, but something close to peace. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Culture change was a marathon, not a sprint, a constant vigilance against the creep of complacency. But they were running the race. And for the first time since her father's death, Sarah believed they might actually finish it. 2.5 years after the confrontation at Gate B-12. Sarah sat in the cockpit of a brand-new 787-10 Dreamliner, the first aircraft in Skyward's next-generation fleet. The registration was N1SKY, a designation she'd chosen personally. The plane represented everything the company had become: efficient, modern, built for the future. Beside her in the first officer's seat sat Michelle Torres, who'd been promoted to senior captain but had volunteered to fly this inaugural route as Sarah's co-pilot. It felt right full circle, the two women who'd flown that first post-Carson flight to Frankfurt, now commanding the flagship of a transformed fleet. "Pre-flight complete, Captain Mitchell," Michelle reported. "Cabin reports ready. We're cleared for pushback." Sarah keyed the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell. Welcome aboard Skyward Flight 1 to Tokyo Narita. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for our airline. This aircraft represents our commitment to safety, efficiency, and innovation. But more importantly, it represents our commitment to you. Every person on this flight, from the pilots to the flight attendants to the mechanics who prepped this bird, they're here because they earned it, because they're the best at what they do, because we refuse to compromise on excellence." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Flying isn't just about getting from point A to point B. It's about trust. You trust us with your lives, your families, your dreams. We don't take that lightly. We never will. Thank you for flying with us. Let's show you what Skyward can do." The applause from the cabin was audible even through the reinforced door. Sarah smiled at Michelle. "Ready, Bourne, ready." They pushed back from the gate, the ground crew guiding them with practiced precision. Sarah ran through the taxi checklist, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 hours. The tower cleared them for takeoff on runway 28R. Sarah advanced the throttles. The engines roared 85,000 pounds of thrust, pushing them down the center line. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. Chicago fell away beneath them, the city her father had loved, the city that had tested her and forged her and ultimately accepted her. Skyward 1. Chicago departure, climb and maintain flight level 350. The voice paused, then added something that wasn't in any script. "Captain Mitchell, congratulations on everything you've built." Sarah's throat tightened. "Thank you, Chicago." Skyward 1 climbing to 350. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Michelle glanced over. "You okay?" Sarah nodded, watching the horizon line hold steady through breaks in the clouds. "Yeah. For the first time in a long time, I actually am." They flew west, chasing the sun, leaving behind the courtrooms and the trials and the ghosts of battles fought. Ahead lay the Pacific, vast and blue and full of possibility. Somewhere below, in cities and suburbs across America, young people were looking up at contrails and dreaming of flight. Some of them would make it. Some would become the captains and first officers who'd carry Skyward into the next generation. And when they did, they'd inherit an airline that valued integrity over convenience, that protected its people instead of its politics, that understood power wasn't about who you could control, but about who you could lift up. Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way in Fire and Pain and the wreckage of a man who'd mistaken cruelty for strength. But she'd learned it, and she'd built something better on the ashes. The horizon stretched before her, infinite and clear. She pointed the nose west and flew toward it, toward whatever challenges waited, knowing she was ready for them. Not because she was fearless, but because she'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing the right thing when fear told you to stay silent. And Sarah Mitchell had found her voice.